think I've got really bad internet or something.
No problem. Selma, we would love to welcome you here with us tonight. And for those of you who don't know Salma Ahmad Caller is an artist, art historian, and writer born in Iraq to an Egyptian father and a British mother. She grew up in Nigeria and Saudi Arabia and now lives in the UK. The focus of her work is on cross-cultural exchange and particularly mixed race identities, experiences, and embodiment, with an art practice that embraces collage, drawing, watercolor, photography, projection, installation, and film. Selma also writes art theory, poetry, and creative nonfiction, drawing on her theoretical background in research on the meanings of ornament in non-Western cultures through frameworks of anthropology of art and cognitive science. Her aim is to contribute to the decolonization of art history and theory, and to break down hegemonic colonial and patriarchal formations in ideas and language. With a master's in art history and art theory, and a background in medicine and pharmacology, and several years teaching cross-cultural ways of seeing through non-Western artifacts at Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, she now works as an independent artist, writer, and filmmaker. Selma's photography, collage work, and writing have been recently published in so many different journals and magazines and platforms. And as you will see now, in a few seconds, Selma has done some incredible visual and written work as well. So without further ado, Selma, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Many thanks, Rula, and it's really great to be here. And thank you for inviting me. Apologies in advance. I also have a really bad cold, so hopefully I won't have a here in Britain where we've all been freezing to death. So hopefully I won't suddenly burst out into a fit of sneezing. So what I'm going to show you today is there'll be a lot of slides of my artwork, collage, photography, and screenshots from my films in between some of my theoretical discussion. And I'm not really going to describe or explain the artworks. I think I'm going to leave that to your imagination to see what you see and figure out what archetypes you think are there. My main concern as an artist who comes from a mixed cultural background, having an Egyptian father and a British mother, and being both English and Egyptian, and I was actually brought up as a Muslim, is trying to come across this cultural boundary. So when I'm studying, whether it's art history or art theory or thinking about my own art practice, I'm always thinking about things from both sides. And I, on and off, have delved into the imaginal realm, or the idea of imagination and creative imagination across East and West. And I haven't come across any solutions to the mystery of how I create artwork. And I've often asking myself, what is imagination and what is an image? And often I've been confronted in studying art history here in the UK with a kind of Western or European art historical construction of an idea of imagination and an image, where an image seems almost based on seeing more than feeling. And so I've been particularly interested in trying to deconstruct that and compare it with some Islamic ideas about imagination and other cultural ideas about imagination. So part of what I'll talk about here is just some of the areas where East and West have kind of crossed over or met, or how they share similarities or difference in some of the books that I'm most interested in. And in one of the key texts that I've had for a while, William Chittick's Ibn Arabi's Metaphysics of Imagination, the Sufi Path of Knowledge, he says, in putting complete faith in reason, the West forgot that imagination opens up the soul to certain possibilities of perceiving and understanding not available to the rational mind. So I'm going to start with a slide by actually a cognitive scientist, because as someone with a medical background, I was interested in imagination and how it works purely from a physiological or a actual how does the brain work. And I would really recommend this book called The Meaning of the Body by Mark Johnson, who unpicks the imagination and how in most Western structures it has no role, when he lays out in his whole book how actually the brain can't work to understand anything without imagination. And he says in his introduction, without imagination, nothing in the world could be meaningful. We could never make sense of our experience without imagination. Without imagination, we could never reason towards knowledge or reality. And he says it's a shocking fact that no theories of meaning and rationality dominant today offer any serious treatment of imagination. And our entire orientation, and he's talking about from a Western perspective, is based on a widely shared set of presuppositions that deny imagination a central role in construction of rationality. So for me, this is very interesting. We usually go to imagination to get away from rationality in some ways, but actually imagination is the very foundation of how we reason and understand as well. So I just wanted to say that's quite a crucial part of thinking. Now, the world of ideas and the world of sensory physical forms are brought together by imagination, according to Ibn Arabi. And so for me, this was an extension of trying to bring together different worlds in my creative vision of how seeing is feeling, and seeing is sensation, and seeing is perceptual, and involves all the multi-sensory experiences of the body. And it isn't some abstract, disembodied image. And it's very much related to experience and the body, but also reaching somewhere else that I could never explain, some other realm. And we could say that this battle is, it seems to be in many philosophies and traditions, is, matter, spirit, material, soul, spiritual, corporeal, visible, invisible, matter, memory, and a kind of battle between the intangible and tangible. Whereas for me, they're very much entwined, entangled, infused, and dissolved in each other. And, that for me made sense in some of Ibn Arabi's theories about imagination. And one of the most specific characteristics of things found within this domain of imagination is their intermediary and ambiguous status. That everything is relational, imaginal things are subtle in relation to corporeal world, but dense in relation to the spiritual, and luminous is in relation to the visible things, but dark in relation to unseen things. If you go and delve into Ibn Arabi more, you'll understand more about what that specifically is about. But just to summarize it, it's that sort of intermingling of different levels and a strata, if you like, that are kind of constantly flowing in and out of each other. And that he often uses terms like the corporealization of the spirits or the spiritualization of corporeal bodies to explain the kinds of events that happen in the imaginal realm. And for me, that's very crucial as an artist, that we
Salma,
are seeing.
Sorry to interrupt you, Selma, but we can't see you. We can see your screen though. So we were just wondering if you had your camera off, or there's
It's
something.
okay. I'll put it back on at
All
the
right.
end. I think
Okay.
I'm
All right.
happy.
Sure.
I look rubbish. You don't need to see me just because I have a cold. So if you're happy for me to continue and just hear my
Oh, of course,
voice,
as you wish. Yes. Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. And you don't look rubbish. So, but whatever
Well,
makes you
that's very
comfortable.
kind of you. So yes, this idea of trying to explain or understand a realm of creativity that seems to be so much more, and seeing, as it's often used, and the optical terminology of language in Western language never seemed to fulfill for me that enough of that feeling that I get when I create. And it's obviously for Ibn Arabi, the term imagination or khayal designates a reality or presence that's manifest in different levels, in the cosmos, in the macrocosm. It intermediates or mediates between the spiritual and corporeal, and it's that imaginal realm. And in the microcosm, the human soul is considered a reality distinct from spirit and body, and that soul pertains to imagination, as well as imagination being more practically a simple faculty, along with other faculties like reason, reflection, and memory. So if you imagine Ibn Arabi saying these things back in the 12th century, which somehow surprisingly ties in with what the cognitive scientist is now saying in the 21st century. So I found these kinds of parallels very fascinating. And fundamentally, the imagination is the intermediate reality and intrinsically ambiguous. So it is and it isn't, and it's both this and both that. And hence it is called a barzakh, which is something that separates two things while never going to one side. And this does speak to my mixed race heritage and living across two cultures. And this way of thinking I found was very appealing, and also that the reality of imagination in Ibn Arabi is it's a constant and continual change in every state and manifestation, which took me also into looking into physics and energy. So I found this, kind of multi-layered exploration of imagination across cognitive science, physics, biology, and philosophy and Sufism, as well as Western history of imagination, are very fascinating. And the barzakh is something intermediate between the luminous, spiritual, and corporeal, and that the imaginal world in Sufism is actually more real than the corporeal world, as it's situated nearer the world of light. But I think for me, actually, if I think that we're honest with ourselves as human beings, this idea of this imaginary world versus an actual real world, the world we see is always framed by our emotions and our ideas and conceptions. And I think that is a kind of imaginal world that's more real than some notion of some totally objective world. And this creature is often seen in some Islamic and Sufi illustrations of a creature, which I've used in my collage here, that usually has a human head and is the one that took the Prophet Muhammad when he ascends on his holy journey. And so this kind of crossover and intermediate between an animal and a human, or hybridity in a way, is something that was really important to me. Understanding imagination is key to various kinds of knowledge that are normally hidden from our rational minds, since imagination is able to combine opposites and contradictions. And here, this is one of my artworks that shows my both Egyptian and Western kind of selves and various elements and symbolism. Make of it what you will, and I create very sort of instinctively. The Mundus Imaginalis is perhaps the closest thing, the Sufi path of knowledge. Henry Corbin, in his book Alone with the Alone, writes about the imaginal, and apparently, according to William Chittick, he's the one that gave us the word imaginal, which I didn't actually know. And this imaginal world has an independent ontological status that's very different from the general idea of, you have an imaginary mind or imaginary world, or you have a fantasy about something, and it exists almost independently. And that idea currently in most Western notions simply doesn't exist. Imagination is very much a superficial thing often, and it's not kind of deeply respected. You either watch fantasy films or you write a fantasy novel. It's not considered a deeply important and essential underpinning to our understanding. And he says that if we lose sight of this realm, then the true import of a great body of mythic and religious teachings slip from our grasp. So I'm just going to slip over a bit more of the Mundus Imaginalis and leave that for you to look up. I'll quickly come to Laura Marks, one of a key text that has really inspired me, Involvement and Infinity, an Islamic Genealogy of New Media Art. And she's working with ideas of philosophy and like Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, but actually underpinning her thinking is Ibn Arabi and other Sufi and Islamic thinking that she brings in to explain the way in which Islamic art actually worked its way into Western contemporary modern art and new media art. So Islamic aesthetics, there's a concept of imaginative representation, which implies an imaginative, subjective recreation of a perceptual experience. So her whole text is drawing on Ibn Sina and Ibn Arabi, and looking at the imaginative faculty as a way to perceive the virtual. And it's a kind of embodied, active way of seeing, rather than a detached idea of the image that I was talking about earlier, that we often encompass, a very embodied and active process of creation and a perception that she is comparing with Islamic art and Western new media art. And she's saying that for imagination for these thinkers is what mediates between the world of ideas and matter, and that we're kind of pulling down divine concepts into material substance by drawing on imagination. And that, to me, when I create, I don't know where things come from, and it does feel like I'm drawing down on something. I'll skip over some of her heavy, dense theory, but I really recommend her book, because she's one of the very few theorists who actually have explored the deeper and hidden influence of Islamic art and Islamic theory and philosophy in Western art. And she gives a lot of historical evidence for her theories that are very fascinating and revealing about the embodiment in the experience of perception in art, rather than the Western often view of representation, where something is standing in for something else, where a symbol or a sign is standing in for something. But rather than being a once removed experience, it's much more multi-layered. And she's drawing on Ibn Arabi and notions of enfolding and unfolding, where everything enfolds and unfolds from each other, which is interesting to compare with Ibn Arabi's elaboration of the world of imagination and the three realms: spiritual, imaginal, and corporeal. And she's bringing this into the world of how we understand Islamic art and new media art, and the enfolding and enfolding and layers that come into that, which is quite a radical and interesting different way of seeing, and a cross-cultural one that appealed to me greatly. And she's also talking about Zahir and Batin, what we can see and what we can't see. And there are two concepts also from Sufism and from Ibn Arabi in particular, where everything is a continuum, and you have things that you see on the outside and things that are on the inside. But I'm just touching on that. I'm sure you probably heard a lot about Zahir and Batin throughout this weekend, but they're also fascinating concepts, so I'll just touch on those there. This is ancient Egyptian eye, which is, for me, feels like it's coming through from another realm into my kind of more English kind of wallpaper with an image. So this is a typical image from one of my films where I'm trying to show East and West. And I'll kind of start to finish off. I don't know how many minutes I've got left, because I took up time with a technical issue, but History of Imagination by Patrick Harpur, he's talking about human unconscious has become the locus of the other world in the West. He says it's a purely Western peculiarity to confuse the literal and the physical due to Christian polarizing of body and soul. I'm not totally sure whether he's right about Christian polarizing of body and soul, because Eastern Christianity, I think, would have a different thing to say about that. But overall, what he's saying is, for most cultures outside of what we might consider modern Western culture, the tradition of the soul is its quasi-material. So the soul is quasi-material and the body is quasi-spiritual and forming a demonic whole, and that many traditions have this in some form or another, except what we consider in the West now. And that other world has kind of gone underground, or has been forced underground into our thinking. And he later on goes on to say that we did have some of these more traditions that might relate to Ibn Arabi and Sufism and Theosophy, which were, for example, Neoplatonism of the Renaissance and German English Romanticism 300 years later, that had an idea of imagination that was closer to that of Ibn Arabi and Sufism, and a notion of primary imagination, where it's independent, autonomous, proceeding, and underpinning perception, where imagination is mythopoeic, myth-making, and very different from fancy. And again, an idea in those Western traditions that there is a mediation between our sensory material world and a world of intelligible forms that are somehow beyond and eternal in the soul of the world or the anima mundi. So he talks about this modern consciousness that banished the notions of soul, of the world, or the imaginal realm, and that was forced to take refuge in the human psyche, creating the modern unconscious. And he says that Jung noticed that the psyche is the world, and to cut oneself off from psyche or soul or unconscious, or however we want to label this other world, is also to become estranged from nature, which ties me back into very important issues about how we've become so detached from our true nature as being, within and part of nature in the climate crisis. And since Cartesian dualism, the Western world has preoccupied itself with subject-object versus other demonic traditions, daemonic as in, where there's a constant flux. And very interestingly, he draws in the idea of Pishog and glamour from Irish fairy tale lore and folklore, where Pishog is enchantment on us, so we can see an object differently, and glamour is an enchantment on the object, so it appears differently. And there is this shifting from subject to object in other cultures where there's a fluidity, where we're dissolving into the things that we're seeing, and they are dissolving into us, which is a synesthesia and kind of much more profound and complex experience and relationship to the world. And this shifting of subjectivity is something Laura Marx also discusses regarding an imaginative, subjective, affective, and embodied response required by Islamic art and new media art, creating an emerging subjectivity and a contemplative one that rides into Western European aesthetics via the decorative arts influenced by Islamic styles and modes. And the abstract line and haptic space suffuses Orientalist and modernist art of the late 19th and early 20th century, where haptic space and abstract line from Islamic art created a nomadic phenomenological subjective state and a state of dissolving and becoming, losing self and merging with the art form versus simply just representing some kind of notion of reality.
Salma, you're at 21. You're at 21 minutes. I'll just defer to Rula for time on what's remaining. But
6 more minutes. Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay. Thank you very much. So this kind of subjective recreation of perceptual experience is mediated by the imaginative faculty, and then via imagination we become in a state somewhere in between the work of art, ourselves, and our bodies. And she also brings us to the rise and fall of embodied perception in Europe. For example, Bergson's Matter and Memory, who describes very much like Islamic philosophers an ideal subject suspended between an internal point inside us and an external world, between memory and perception, interiority and dispersal, which we could have said that Bergson is basically talking about Ibn Arabi's Barzakh in many ways. So I think I'm almost at the end. I just talked literally about literalism. We've become so literal-minded that the only reality we recognize is literal reality. Our modern perspective is peculiar in that it is the only perspective that insists it isn't one. We have no choice of which myth we look through, but we do not have the choice of no myth at all, which connects me back to where I started in this talk with actually cognitive science and how the brain works. And the only way that our brain works is using the metaphor or structure through which to see and understand the world, which you could equate with myth, and creating an embodied multisensory framework for comprehending, and that we're always seeing through and with some kind of structure or lens, you could say, but a lens is too optical for me and involves the whole full experience of the body. So what we're seeing is always profoundly much more multisensory. So I've slipped through. I think I'll stop here, Rula. I've gotten things about the mediatrix that also I've drawn on and interest me, that exist in Ibn Arabi's Sufism, in general, and Sophiology, but that's another a whole complicated thing. So I'll end with just: woman is a beam of the divine light. She is not the being whom sensual desire takes as its object. She is creator, and it should be said, she is not a creature. So I think I'll end my presentation there.
You still have 4 minutes, Salma, if you want to use them.
I think I'll come back to the screen, which I'm trying to stop. Okay, you can hopefully see me and hear me still.
We can, yes.
So yeah, so I had to kind of run through that quite rapidly, and I know I touched on quite a lot of really complicated east-west crossovers and entanglements that are quite hard to unpick in this sort of time frame, especially if you're not used to thinking about them. But hopefully I've given you some ideas. I'll just quickly share with you some of the texts that have inspired me then in the last couple of minutes. This is a very, very fascinating book, and I highly recommend it, as he goes through many of the interesting Western traditions that we may not have heard about, that resonate with some ideas of Sufism. Alone with the Alone is a fascinating work, which some people say is Henry Corbin is so entangled with Ibn Arabi that maybe you don't always know which is whom. Hence, maybe this is a slightly more supposedly William Chittick on the Sufi path of knowledge and imagination, is just to give you another perspective on that. And this is Enfoldment and Infinity, which is by Laura U. Marks, and really one of the most unusual texts, where she goes through and shows how Islamic art and philosophy is involved. And this is The Body and the Mind, and he has another text called The Meaning of the Body, and how it gets left out, including his theory of imagination. So those are some of my key texts that have influenced how I think and investigate my East-West approaches to imagination.
Could you show us
that was an incredible encapsulation. Oh, the first book, The Philosopher's Secret Fire.
Oh yes, Patrick Harpur. Yes, it's called The Philosopher's Secret Fire, A History of the Imagination. So that's I really recommend it. He's not going into Sufism or Ibn Arabi, but he does go into the supposedly non-rational history of imagination in Europe that has kind of been sidelined and forgotten. And he thinks that it had to be put into things like Jung's collective unconscious, and these ideas of other folklore traditions of daemons and other creatures and other worlds became so unorthodox and frowned upon that they had to kind of take flight and hide, and they reappeared in our modern consciousness as our unconscious.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Salma, Shadab, we want to thank you both for these incredible talks and poems and visual art. This has been really amazing. I mean, you've put in so much, and in such a beautiful and easy to understand way, and challenging at the same time. Our minds are all around. They're all over the place right now. Thank you so much for giving us this nice boost of thinking and imagination and all that. And Jonathan, do we have the discussion session coming up next, or are we going to go for the next talk?